I saw this over and over again. Christina's willingness and ability to allow the children to really use their languages allows them a voice that would have never occurred if all they had been writing for a whole year was, I see a student, I see a teacher. The other thing that she does is when she does all the vocabulary build-up, she not only makes explicit connections between English and Spanish, those are the only two languages that she knows, and she uses cognates in Spanish, but she has the students write the word in their language in whichever way they can, and you have to remember she can't correct any of this, and she adds the translations to the class word wall so that there is a context here of the children's languages and this translanguaging being a way of making sense of a new language. I'm now going to take you to a 5th grade class. This is a two-way bilingual education class. Again, half of the children were Spanish speakers when they started, and half were English speakers when they started. But now it's 6 years later, they're all quite bilingual, they're being educated in the two languages. This is what is called a self-contained classroom, only one teacher. And this teacher does Spanish in the morning and English in the afternoon. That's how she separates her languages. She thinks, remember that these are, again, structures which I think are necessary. She does Spanish in the morning, but of course as a recently arrived child. You know, when we set up structures, administrators and bureaucrats set up structures, we think, okay, so you start in kindergarten, by 5th grade, everything's going to be solved, everybody's going to be bilingual. But of course, the world doesn't work like that because the kids keep coming. So in this class, there is one who has just recently arrived. So what to do with this class? Well, again, there's a lot of translanguaging. And what we see in this class, because the children are mostly bilingual, is that the teacher's lecturing in one language, and if you look at what the kids are doing, they're taking notes in another language, right? All the time, or in two languages. Sometimes they read in one language, and when they're in small groups to do the discussion, they're discussing it in Spanish, or vice versa. And the same thing with some of them reading in one language and writing in the other. And then the post-it notes. Because we are doing this balanced literacy, the children are taught to write questions on post-it notes when they have a question about the text they're reading, so that then when they get into their groups, they can ask intelligent questions, right? But the post-it notes are always a poem to me because they are written in any language, in any way that you can imagine, because now these children have these two languages at their disposal, and they're really translanguaging in order to make sense. Here's an example of what happens with the students' work. So she does U.S. history in Spanish, and this is a U.S. history class in which she's asking the students to answer those questions that appear up there. They're about colonial life in an essay. But this student has figured out, she knows how to write an essay in English because they have been taught these very prescriptive ways of writing an essay. I'm sure you do it too, right? The introduction, the body in the middle, and the conclusion at the end. So what she does is she's putting her two ways of understanding to make sense of this essay. But in New York State, some of the exams are translated into 5 of the major languages. And they have to pass the English exam, but all the content exam is translated. So what happens then is the children are asked, do you want to take the exam in English or in Spanish in this case? The whole class says, we want to do it in English, even though they have been taught this is the social studies test. Remember they're having the content in Spanish, social studies, but they're going to do the test in English. But of course, this Spanish-speaking child who just arrived is following as they do this review with the text in Spanish. Most of the discussion is in English, but they're always translating for the child who doesn't speak English. And they're looking up their notes, which remember they had written in Spanish because the content was being taught in Spanish. And sometimes when that happens and they're reading from a text in Spanish, the discussion changes to Spanish. And always they're writing in English because they're taking the test in English, but referring to material that was written in Spanish. So constantly this translanguaging, which enables them to make sense of a very difficult content for them. I'll just say a word about the international high schools. The international high schools are a series of high schools that have been developed in New York City for newly arrived immigrants. But one of the wonderful things about the international high schools, and the reason why I think they've been so successful, is that they have wonderful pedagogy. I always say that you cannot think about these issues of helping students with the language development unless you've also figured out how to teach, right? So you have to extend it. But one of the principles that they hold dear is that the locus of control of language lies with the students. This is a core of their teaching. These are high school students, they're 15-year-olds when they come with very little English, having to pass in 4 years very demanding exams in order to graduate from high schools. So the front teaching, when the teacher is in the front of the room, that is always done in English. However, the students read and research in many languages. There's no reason why high school students now, with the availability of the web and computers and the internet and all of it that they have at their disposal, cannot do the research in other languages. When the teacher interacts with the small groups, he or she interacts in ways that honor whatever languages they're working on. When the students are using a language a teacher doesn't understand, which happens all the time, she or he asks one of the more advanced emergent bilingual students to offer a translation. So the burden is on the students. They can use whatever language they want, but they have to make sure that their teacher understands what it is they're doing. Google Translate is something that you see all the time being used. And so that the idea always is allow the students to think, be educated, research in whatever languages they have at their disposal. Just make sure that it makes sense to the teacher. And sometimes that is done by giving a one-sentence summary, sometimes by saying, look it up in the Google Translate, sometimes by having a more advanced student translate for the teacher. So I want to remind you why translanguaging is an important practice, and I'm doing this through 2 quotes by Jim Cummins. Jim says, when students' first language is invoked as a cognitive and linguistic resource through bilingual instructional strategies, it can function as a stepping stone to scaffold more accomplished performance in the second language. And he recently has said, bilingual instructional strategies open up the pedagogical space in ways that legitimate the intelligence, imagination, and linguistic talents of English language learner students. I just want to remind you that then what we have said is that emergent bilinguals do not acquire a separate additional language, and we have to stop thinking that way. But what they do is that they develop and integrate new language practices into a very complex, dynamic bilingual repertoire in which translanguaging is both the supportive context and the communicative web itself. I want to make sure you understand this, because what I am saying is that translanguaging is not simply just a scaffolding mechanism, is not simply the supportive context. It is also part of the communicative repertoire of these children. And I want to remind you that this is much like what happens to a spider web. The spider web is a joint product of the spider who is building the web, but also on the supportive context, on the walls, the branches, whatever, that spider is building that web with. So it's not only the supportive context, translanguaging, but also the communicative web itself. Y muchísimas gracias.